Bava Kamma Daf Ches. We begin with the last few lines of Daf Zayin. The Gemara is discussing the halacha which we've seen in our Mishnah about an animal which entered someone else's rishos and caused a damage to his property. So the Mishnah had said that it depends how he got in there. If he fell in there, the animal fell into the other person's rishos, and therefore the owner of the animal is an einus, could not have expected it to go in there. He doesn't have to pay for the damage that he caused. However, if he got a hana from it, he does have to pay for that hana. If, however, the animal entered normally, and therefore the owner is responsible for allowing his animal to get in there, then he has to pay not only for the hana that he received, but also for the damage that he caused. So the Gemara is going to discuss these two halachos one at a time. The Gemara first says, so we said that if the owner is not responsible for the animal entering the rishos because he fell in, you still have to pay for the hana. What hana? What hana that the animal received do you need to pay for? So the Gemara quotes Rav, and we'll have two versions as to what Rav meant. Rav says you have to pay for the crops that the animal fell on, cushioning his blow and him not getting hurt. And if his fall also caused the damage to the crops, then he has to pay for that hana that he got from the crops. However, that if he ate some of the food there, then Rav doesn't say. The Gemara assumes the implication is that if he ate, he doesn't have to pay for that hana. Since he fell in there by accident, the owner couldn't be responsible for him getting in there. You don't have to pay for the hana that he ate. What's the logic in that? So says the Gemara at first, it seems to be Rav l'shitase. Rav, we said elsewhere that the animal should not have eaten. So here the owner could say, it's not my fault, my animal should not have eaten. Says the Gemara, no, it's not comparable at all. What did Rav say? Rav said if somebody brings his fruits into someone else's rishos, and then that person, the owner of that rishos, his animal went and ate the fruits, and he hurt himself by eating too much, so the owner of the fruits doesn't have to pay for that, because he could say, what did the animal eat so much for? He should not have eaten. But here you're talking about where the mazik ate, so what the owner of the mazik animal will say, I don't have to pay you because my animal shouldn't have eaten. What's the logic in that? If he's the one who got hurt, so you could say, I don't have to pay him for hurting himself, he shouldn't have eaten so much. But if he went and hurt someone else, I could pater myself by saying my animal shouldn't have eaten. That doesn't make sense. So the Gemara therefore revises it, and the Gemara says, no, you have to pay for both actually. What Rav meant to say was, not only do you have to pay for what he ate, you also have to pay, even if he didn't eat, it just cushioned his blow. What's a chiddush in that? So you may think as follows. You may think it's not a real hana that the owner of the crops did for him. All he did was that he prevented him from getting hurt. He didn't actually give him a hana. He didn't actually benefit from him. It just stopped him from being injured. That's what we call mavriya chari, chasing away a lion. If I chase away a lion from you, you didn't actually get a hana out of that. You just didn't get injured by that. So I saved you from that. So the halacha is that mavriya chari, I don't necessarily have to pay you. You chase a lion away from me, I don't have to pay you for that. So here you may think that the owner of the animal shouldn't have to pay the owner of the crops, because he could say, all you did was prevent me from injury, I shouldn't have to pay you for that. Kamash Balon, Rav, no, you do have to pay for that as well. Now why? Why is it different than really chasing away a lion? So Gemara says two reasons. One, when you chase away a lion, you're doing it intentionally. You are understanding that you are now working for me, and you are doing something for me, and you're not going to get paid for it. Here, the owner of the crops didn't have any intent there. His field was just there, and therefore you can't say you knew what you were doing and you knew you weren't going to receive anything for that. He didn't make a decision in the matter. And the second factor is that when you chase away a lion from hurting someone, you didn't lose anything. You just chased him. There's no investment. You didn't lose in that process. Here, though, the owner of the crops, his crops were ruined by the animal falling on it, and therefore there is a loss. Okay, that's so good. Now the Gemara wants to know, when this animal, which we said fell in, he doesn't have to pay for the hezek, how did he fall? So Rav Kahana says he fell because he urinated and he slipped in his own urine. Rava says he was knocked by another animal. He had a bunch of animals together. One animal pushed the other animal and it fell in. Says the Gemara, that's a bigger chiddush that the owner is pater for that. So according to Rav Kahana, who says that he slipped in his own urine, that's real einus, he would not agree to that. He would say, no, if the animals pushed each other, then the owner is responsible for having them walk so close together. He should have spread them apart. Rava, though, who says that the owner is not responsible for that either, that's also called an einus, would certainly say that a case where he urinated and slipped in that the owner is not responsible for that either. There is no way. Now, the Gemara was another halacha, and this is what happens if the animal falls and he gets up and he eats from somewhere else. So is that included in the original einus, that the owner is not responsible for the fact that he fell in there? So Rav Kahana says no. You only putter from paying for the hezek in that area where he fell, and you have to pay for the hana. Rav Yochanan says no. Even if he went up and went somewhere else and he wandered around the field until he left, and you know about it, and he came back in, and the owner knows about it and didn't stop him, he's pater. All of that is included in the oinus that the owner is not responsible that he was in there. Now, if Papa adjusts that, he says no, that he left. You have to know that he left. You don't have to know that he went back in. It's your responsibility to make sure he doesn't go back in. Because once you know he went in there, he's already familiar with the place. He had a good meal there. He's going to be attracted to go back there. So you have to step up your shmir to make sure that he's not going to get in there. Okay, now we move on to the halacha that if the animal went in there normally, the owner is responsible for that, and then he has to pay for any hezek that was caused by that. So one says, Rabbi Yirmiyah had a question, what if he went in there normally, but the hezek that he caused was not a normal hezek? He didn't, or she in this case, it's not that she went in there and she ate. What actually happened is that she gave birth, and the birth fluids ruined the crops. So do you have to pay for that? That's an oinus. However, you're a pshia for allowing it in there. So this is what we call tchilas b'pshia v'sayfa b'oinus. The pshia, you're negligent for allowing your animal to get into someone else's field. However, what actually happened was an oinus that it gave birth. So the question, this would be a standard tchilas b'pshia v'sayfa b'oinus. So this is a question that is being asked by Rabbi Yirmiyah. So he's saying, if you hold that tchilas b'pshia v'sayfa b'oinus is chayiv, that you're responsible for that anyway, so here you're for sure responsible for it. Because there's also tchilas b'pshia v'sayfa b'oinus. However, the Gemara's question, Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking, maybe this is worse than a classic tchilas b'pshia v'sayfa b'oinus, because tchilas b'pshia v'sayfa b'oinus, the oinus is a real oinus. You cannot have expected that. Here, you knew your animal was pregnant. You knew she was going to give birth soon. So perhaps it's not a real oinus. You could say, since you knew it was pregnant, you have to be watching it more carefully and making sure that this is not going to happen. So maybe this is not a real tchilas b'pshia v'sayfa b'oinus. So Gemara leaves it as a teiku. The question remains unresolved. Okay, the Gemara moves on to our next sugya, and that's the next line in the Mishnah, which says, how do you evaluate how much you pay when an animal eats from someone else's field? So we saw machlokes in the Mishnah whether you evaluate an entire base saw. You look at the entire base saw that the eaten food was in. How much is the base saw worth before the damage? How much is it worth after the damage? And that's how you evaluate it. That way the actual amount will be far less. And that's the Bava Kamma. Shita, Rabbi Shimon says, no, if it's whole fruits, you evaluate the actual fruits themselves. So now the Gemara says, first of all, where do we get this halacha that you don't just evaluate the fruits straight up? That the Bava Kamma says, where do we see that you're evaluating a larger field as a whole? So the Gemara brings a pasuk as the source. It says, "Ubir b'stei acher," and the animal when it's eating, it causes destruction. It says that it eats in someone else's fields. So you see that you evaluate the field. You look at the hezek as being field related. The field was devalued, so now the field has to be revalued by the mazik having to pay for it. But it's a field issue, not a fruit issue. So the Gemara says, one second, but this ubir b'seacha teaches me something else. It teaches me that Shane, the av nezikin of Shane, is only in someone else's field. It's not in a public field. B'stei acher, in that person's field. So Gemara says there's two reasons that you have a second drasha here. First of all, if it was just to teach me that, it could have said b'stei chaverei, or it could have said stei acher. What's b'stei acher? Those two things, two ways to say that I have a second drasha here, and that's this, that you evaluate the entire field, not just the fruits. So Gemara says maybe it's just for that. How do you know that you have a right to say the additional halacha that the shein is only in Rishus HaNizik and not Rishus HaRabim? So Gemara says if it would only be saying it's halacha that you evaluate the field, then it should be talking in the place of the tashlumin. Why does it say it in the place of the actual hezek? So it must be talking about something about the hezek that it needs to tell me. The hezek has to be b'stei achar, not just the tashlumin. Okay, that's the source. Now, how do we actually make the evaluation? How do we establish the value of the base saw? So the Gemara says you don't just evaluate the base saw itself. You evaluate an area of 60 base saw, take that entire amount, divide it by 60, and that's the value of one base saw. Then you do that again after the hezek, and then you see how much it was devalued. That's a very large number then that you're actually comparing the value of. That is the first opinion, and that is Rav Yossi bar Chanina. Rabbi Yanai says, no, you don't take 60 base saw, you take 30 base saw, that is 60 half base saws, but the number of 60 is the key here. Chizki says you actually take 30 stalks. So all of them say that you look at a large unit of 60, and then you divide by 60 to achieve the complete evaluation. So the Gemara asks, why are you saying that we evaluate by 60 and not just the thing itself? We have a brayso that seems to say otherwise. It says if you eat a kav or two kavin, you don't say you pay for that kav itself, but you look at it as if it's part of a small aruga, and you evaluate that row itself, that small row itself. But it doesn't say anything about shishim. So the Gemara says, no, it means b'shishim. It means the way you establish the evaluation of the row is by looking at 60 rows and dividing by 60 itself. Okay, now the Gemara brings a brayso, which will have two ways of explaining. The brayso says you don't evaluate a kav by itself because it's going to it'll drive the value up too high. You don't evaluate by a base core, which is a large area, because it's going to drive down the value too much. So what does this mean? Says Rav Papa, it means as follows. You don't evaluate a kav against 60 kav because it's going to drive the value to the advantage of the mazik. He's going to pay very little. And you don't evaluate a core against 60 core because it's going to hurt the mazik by driving the value up too much. So here we're referring to the actual crops. A kav is a measure of crop, and a core is a measure of crop. Says the Gemara, but the Bryce didn't say crops. Rav Huna bar Menayach asked, it doesn't say crops. It doesn't say core. It says a base core, which is an area of land. So therefore, we have to explain it differently. Rav Huna bar Menayach says it means as follows, and he says this in the name of Rav Acha Breda of Ika. You shouldn't evaluate a kav by itself because it causes too much to the benefit of the nizik. It drives up the price too much. You shouldn't evaluate a kav as part of an entire base core. That's what I mean in a base core, because it causes a pagam to the nizik. It drives value down too much. So what it means to say is you do shishim. You do 1/60th. You do 60 times the actual crop itself. Now the Gemara brings an incident that happened, which takes into another related sugya. So there was a person who cut down someone else's tree. And he came before the nizik, that is, came before the Reish Galusa, the X large, for an evaluation. So he said, listen, I saw that tree, it was a triple tree. It was 3 trunks growing together, and the complete value of the triple was 100 zuz. So go pay him 33 1/3 zuz. So the way he evaluated was in a group of 3. So he said, why do I need to go to the Reish Galusa, who gives me a halacha of the Persians? Let me go to the Chachamim. So he came to Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman said, you evaluate as 1 of 60. So Rava said to him, hold on a second. 1 of 60, we said when a person's property causes the damage. That's if, let's say, his ox goes and eats. But if he himself cut down a tree, who says you evaluate out of the 60? Maybe the evaluation should be higher, so that the price should be higher, and you evaluate the actual tree that was ruined itself. So Abaye says to Rava, why do you think there should be a difference if he caused the damage himself? Is it because you have a brisa? So I'm going to bring you a similar brisa for the animals, and then you won't have an issue. So the brisa that he says is because the brisa says if somebody destroys someone else's vineyard when it was in the blossoming grapes stage, that's the level of growth that it was at. So we see how much it was worth before and how much it's worth after, and that's how you evaluate it. And it doesn't say anything about out of 60 times the amount. So Abaye is saying to Rava, that's your proof that when a person destroys, you don't evaluate out of 60 itself. The problem is that when an animal destroys, you have the same brisa, and therefore it shouldn't be a difference. This brisa that you have about a person's destruction doesn't prove anything because you have the same thing about an animal's destruction. Where is that? So the Gemara quotes the brisa. It says if a animal ate plants in someone else's field. So Rabbi Yossi says those who made rules in Yerushalayim, they said that a plant that is 2 years old is worth 2 silver coins. If it's 1 year old, that is, it's worth 2 silver coins. If it's 2 years old, it's worth 4 silver coins. Now, what if you ate a vineyard in a various stage of growth? Do you evaluate how much it's worth at the time he ate it, or do you evaluate what it could have grown into? So that's a machlekes, and we have 2 cases of that machlekes. If he ate it in the chaziz level, that's when it's first green shoots. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says you look at what was left. That is, you look at the rest of the field and you see when it grows to be full height, how much is it worth then? And based on that, you evaluate what this could have grown to. And if something happens to the crop and it doesn't grow to full height, you won't have to pay as much. The Chachamim say no. You just look at what he actually destroyed. What was it worth before? What's it worth now? And that's how you evaluate. Now, the Gemara continues quoting the Brisa at length, and it has the same machlokes between the Chachamim and someone else on a number of different stages of growth of the grape or even of the fig plant. Has the machlokes, and it's various different Tanaim that argue on the Chachamim at each growth stage. You have it at the stage of green growth. You have it at the stage of what the Brisa calls lulve gifanim and yichure te'enim, which is when it's just beginning to bud. Slightly before the flower, it's just beginning to grow, like the branches that will bear the fruits. Then you have the flower stage, and then you have when the actual fruit begins to grow, and then you have when the fruit is much larger. So at each of the stages, we have different machlokes, and we'll get into those shitas more at length in the next daf. But the Gemara's point is that this brisa doesn't say anything about shishim. It doesn't mention shishim anywhere. So you see, even though it is an animal, even though it is nechasim, it's memoined because the hezek. It doesn't mention shishim, and yet we know that shishim is the halacha according to his opinion. So therefore, you can't ask a kasha from the fact that we have a brisa about Adam that doesn't mention it, because we have a brisa about animals that doesn't mention it either.